Hey, this is Derek, and listen to Skepticality, the official audio program of Skeptic Magazine, for Tuesday, October 16th, 2012.
Skepticality. Science!
Welcome back to another episode of Skepticality, the show that features news and interviews from critical thinkers and skeptics for the promotion and exploration of the world of science. With it turning October here in the northern half of the planet, the ushering in of the cooler weather, and interesting folklore dealing with all things creepy, spooky, and dead. However, there is one place you can get yourself some old-fashioned critical thinking. That would be at CSI Con in Nashville, Tennessee. It's coming up in about, a week, between October 25th and 28th. However, that is part of something that would often go into the news and information that our own Tim Farley would usually discuss in his segment all about the past and the future in the world of skeptical thought.
I'm Tim Farley of whatstheharm.net and skeptools.com, and this is Skepticism Past and Future. In the past, we've got illusions of all kinds. And in the future, the year of the Skeptools continues. A recurring theme in skepticism is illusions of various kinds, perceiving one thing as truth when something else entirely is going on. This is why magicians are often skeptics, because illusions are their stock in trade. The Fox sisters found they could create the illusion of ghost noises in their house in the 1840s, and inadvertently gave birth to the entire spiritualism movement, which persists to this day. But years later, on October 21st, 1888, Margaret Fox confessed that as a girl, she and her sisters had created the sounds in part by cracking their knuckles. They died paupers. Another illusion is created by astrological horoscopes, which are usually terribly vague, but give the illusion of being accurate. Psychologist Bertram Forer described and tested this phenomenon and called it the Forer effect. He was born October 24th, 1914, and died in 2000. On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles created an audio illusion of an alien invasion on the radio. This fooled some home listeners, though not as many as some popular accounts would have you believe. Mass media illusions have continued to the present day. One was a French mockumentary that claimed that none other than filmmaker Stanley Kubrick was hired by NASA to fake the moon landings. It was called Operation Loon, and it first aired on French and German TV on October 16, 2002, 10 years ago. It was made in part from real interview footage of people such as Buzz Aldrin and Henry Kissinger, borrowed from other documentaries, and thus some moon hoaxers still cite it as a real source sometimes. One of the simplest forms of illusion is an optical illusion, which plays on the workings of our eyes and brains. One of the most famous is the drawing that can sometimes simultaneously appear to be a duck and a rabbit. Although it was popularized by psychologist Joseph Jastrow, it actually originates with an illustration published in a German humor magazine on October 23, 1892, and is thus turning 120 years old this month. In the future, the year of the skeptical software tool seems to be continuing. I mentioned this trend last episode, but even more tools have been released or are coming in the future. One is a Photoshop plugin called Formatch, which was released in September. This software uses a huge database of information about how various cameras behave and can very quickly tell you if a digital photo has been unaltered since it left the camera. This could be very useful for ghost, cryptid, and other investigators needing to determine if a photo has been doctored. Another tool for skeptics, which went live in September, is pundittracker.com. This is a partially crowdsourced database of predictions made by media pundits in politics, finance, and sports. Each prediction is recorded and rated on its boldness, and then later judged on whether it turned out to be true. Thus, those who make public predictions can be held accountable for their track record. Perhaps skeptics should encourage this site to start including psychics as well. Some congratulations are in order for Professor Seth Kalicman of the University of Connecticut. He writes an excellent blog about AIDS denialism. Earlier this year, he received a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to establish an anti-vaccine surveillance and alert system. From the grant summary, this will, quote, establish an internet-based global monitoring and rapid alert system for finding, analyzing, and counteracting misinformation communication campaigns regarding vaccines. And it's all to support global immunization efforts. Now that's a new skeptical tool that we need quite badly. This year of the skeptical tools thing has become such a trend that I've begun posting a daily news roundup on my Skeptical Software Tools blog called Morning Toolbox, in which I list new tools and techniques that can be used by skeptics online. I hope you'll check it out. Oh, and if you are attending the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry's SciCon event in Nashville in 2 weeks, be sure to say hello. I will be attending. And this brings us to the end of another edition of Skepticism Past and Future. Links to additional material are in the show notes, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook under the name Krelnik, Krelnik, for a daily fact from skepticism's past and ongoing news of skepticism's future.
This is Bob Carroll, creator of the Skeptic's Dictionary and the blog Unnatural Acts That Can Improve Your Thinking. Welcome to another episode of Unnatural Virtue. Today's topic is mind over matter. Have you ever wondered about the origin of the idea that you can cure just about any disease you might be plagued with, have just about anything you desire, or even move pencils or cause lightning to strike just by thinking about it? The idea seems so blatantly false and contradicted on an almost daily basis in almost everyone's life that it makes you wonder whether there's something wrong with the human brain that such an idea could have a stronghold on us. It's one thing to say that suggestion and priming ourselves or others with words or images can influence future thoughts and actions, but we seem to leave the realm of sensibility when we extend this notion to claim that we can actually alter reality just by thinking about it. The idea is at least as old as the New Testament. In the Gospel according to Mark, 10:24 for those who are counting, there's a passage that says something like, "Whatever you desire, pray and believe that you will receive them, and you will have them." This idea, or one very much like it, influenced a number of people in the 19th century in what was called the mind cure or New Thought movement. Today, this idea of the power of positive thinking, of the mind to control and alter reality, has hundreds of New Age gurus fighting for the minds of followers seeking the secret of success. Healers from Barbara Brennan to Marianne Williamson owe a great debt to Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, who died in 1866 and was known as the father of New Thought. Quimby was a New England clockmaker and a follower of the methods of Anton Mesmer. Quimby came to believe that their healing ability was not due to animal magnetism, as Mesmer thought, but to Abraham's God, and that they'd accidentally stumbled upon the healing technique of Jesus and other faith healers. They probably had, but Quimby didn't think the healing had anything to do with the power of suggestion, the optimism of the healer, the strong motivation of the sick to be rid of their various ailments, many of them psychological, the faith of the patient in the cure and the healer, or the rituals and theater of the healing. Quimby called his healing practice by many names, including Christian Science, which was appropriated by one of his patients, Mary Baker Eddy. After Quimby's death, one of Eddy's students, Emma Curtis Hopkins, organized New Thought and turned it into a national movement. Religion, healing, and imagined contact with occult forces give people a sense of purpose and control in an indifferent and cruel world. In the 19th century, religion, healing, and the occult were three of the few avenues to power and control that were open to women. So it is perhaps no accident that many of the early proponents of New Thought and mind cure were women. Others who spread the ideas of New Thought were Myrtle Page Fillmore, Annie Ricks Millets, Melinda Elliott Kramer, and Nona L. Brooks. The dominating idea of all forms of New Thought is that thoughts or beliefs have an effect on things and people around us, independently of our doing anything. Thinking creates reality. Happiness and health are the direct result of our beliefs and thoughts. We have the power to change our beliefs and thus our state in life at will. If we are sick, it is because we are not thinking correctly. If misfortune befalls us, it is because we are not thinking correctly. Health is due to correct thought. The truth will set you free, and the truth is that you need only faith to be healthy, rich, saved, whatever. Also central to many forms of New Thought is the idea that a God or spirit or energy or universal life force, something mysterious and powerful, permeates everything, or is everything in it. Thinking correctly involves being one with, in harmony with, aligned with, or attuned to this universal whatever. The American physician, psychologist, philosopher, and dabbler in the paranormal, William James, called New Thought a deliberately optimistic scheme of life. James traced the origin of New Thought to the Gospels, New England Transcendentalism, the idealism of Bishop George Berkeley, and Spiritism. James thought that the New Thought or mind cure movement, with its emphasis on hope, was a reaction to the religious evangelism that emphasized fear. These two great motivators, hope and fear, seem to play a major role in the history of people trying to persuade others to follow them. We see it not only in religion, but in politics as well. In addition to promoting delusions about the ability of people to cure others and themselves of horrible diseases by the power of thought, the New Thought movement encourages delusions in other areas of life. Outside of the healing arena, New Thought beliefs contribute to what might be called the empowerment delusion. The false belief that feeling empowered or believing you are empowered is the same as being empowered. The empowerment delusion leads people to believe that they can create health or wealth or anything material by willing it or asking a God to will it. A corollary is the delusion that poverty or sickness is their own fault. Their bad thoughts, stinking thinking, negative ideas, or lack of faith cause all misery. The empowerment delusion is fed by appeals to the law of attraction, quantum physics, or to faith in faith. The billion-dollar self-help industry is largely driven by the empowerment delusion. I'm sorry to say that there's not even any evidence for the related idea that having a positive attitude and being upbeat is good for your health. A study of nearly 60,000 people in Finland and Sweden who were followed for almost 30 years found no significant association between personality traits and the likelihood of developing or surviving cancer. The scientists concluded that, quote, cancer doesn't care if we're good or bad, virtuous or vicious, compassionate or inconsiderate. Neither does heart disease or AIDS or any other illness or injury. End quote. I'm sorry if that bit of news makes bad people feel good and good people feel bad, but that's the way it is. Well, that's it for this episode of Unnatural Virtue. To find out more about the topics mentioned here, see the show notes, my website, The Skeptic's Dictionary, and my blog, Unnatural Acts That Can Improve Your Thinking. In the meantime, please commit some unnatural acts in public. And don't forget, skepticism, though unnatural, is a virtue.
Hello and welcome to The Odds Must Be Crazy on Skepticality, where crazy things happen every day. Well, every week. Well, every 2 weeks. Well, whenever Derek isn't busy managing a convention.
I'm Wendy Hughes.
And I'm Jarrett Kaufman, and we're here to tell you stories that will take you where no man has gone before.
Nor woman.
It's only a matter of time, Wendy. We're an adaptable species.
At least you didn't tell the listeners that I've been around the block.
If they've listened to you on other podcasts, I think they already know. Anyway, this week's story comes to us courtesy of the co-host of the wonderful podcast Oh No, Ross and Carrie, designer of the Odds Must Be Crazy's logo, and our friend, Ross Blotcher.
Ross is a multi-talented fellow. Artist, podcaster, family man, and athlete. Oh, and don't forget, you can find this story on our site today under the name Super Secret Safe Word, or via the show notes. Ross writes,
I'd been invited to a friend's kickball party, and before the game, a bunch of us were sitting around in the shade, catching up and talking about random topics. One such subject was that of secret codes and safe words between friends and family in the event of an emergency. My friend said, if I were being held at gunpoint and had to call my boyfriend, I've got a secret safe word I can insert into the conversation to let him know I'm in trouble. I laughed and then mimicked a conversation on my thumb and pinky phone. Hey, Nick, I've got to go to the store first and pick up some watermelon. There was an awkward silence as my friend looked at me quizzically and a little taken aback. Finally, she said, Wait, how did you know that? I didn't tell you that. Watermelon was my safe word. Now I've got to come up with a new one. Now, if only I had said I was psychic before that, I could have really cashed in.
So Ross wasn't reading her mind, but she didn't know what to think. He didn't really know the safe word. He was just guessing, right?
When our friend and resident analificator Barbara Drescher reviewed the stories for The Odds Must Be Crazy, she explained it in terms that we face all the time. Thinking up a safe word has all the same dilemmas as thinking up passwords for our various email, bank, and credit card accounts.
I worry about that all the time. One of my email accounts was hacked recently. So what did Barbara come up with?
Barbara says, I could not even begin to calculate the odds of this, and I can't explain my own reaction either, but I will try. My first thought was, that's a guessable safe word.
Aha! Well, if even Barbara's having trouble with this one, I guess I don't feel so bad.
Barbara went on, I think that when we try to think of passwords and safe words, we are trapped by the availability of words in our vocabulary. You want a word obscure enough that it wouldn't normally be used in conversation, but one that can be worked into a conversation without too much trouble. Watermelon seems to me to be a good level of obscurity, but if the story omitted the safe word, then asked readers to predict what the word was, would I have guessed it? No way to tell, really.
So, knowing the end of the story cancels out the surprise ending. Kind of like reading the last page of an espionage novel.
The safe word would come in handy for the spy who needs to come in from the cold.
I'd trust you with my password, Jarrett.
That's so sweet, Wendy. The feeling is not mutual.
Oh. Well, with that disappointing news, thank you for listening to The Odds Must Be Crazy. Please be sure to visit theoddsmustbecrazy.com and leave comments on all our stories. Be sure to include your password. In the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, circle us on Google+, and validate us in life. Hit the Submit a Story link on our site to share your own crazy stories, or tweet the short ones with the hashtag TOMBC.
The Odds Must Be Crazy is a project in collaboration with the Independent Investigations Group in Los Angeles, California. Visit them at iigwest.org. Barbara Drescher is a contributing editor to our blog and can also be found at icbseverywhere.com.
Special thanks to our producer and sound engineer, Brian Hart. Our theme music comes to us courtesy of Mr. Deity himself, Brian Keith Dalton. You can find him at MrDeity.com.
And between now and the next episode, take the time now to change all your passwords, passphrases, safe words, and pins, and use completely random letters and numbers to ensure nobody can ever guess them.
But what if they can't remember them?
Well, they can email them to me for safekeeping.
You mean to us?
I mean to me.
A huge thanks to Tim, Bob, Jarrett, and Wendy. We here at Skepticality HQ get lots of feedback about the great work you guys do to give us your segments each episode. Our guest this time around happens to be Dr. Darrel Ray. Darrel is a psychologist who has been a student of religion most of his life. He holds degrees in religion, sociology, anthropology, and a doctorate in psychology. I found time to read his latest book, Sex and God. I was able to get some time with him to sit down and discuss his book and how his fascination with the intersection of religion and sex all came about. So, today I'm here with Dr. Darrel Ray.
Good to be with you, Derek.
I've been trying to get you on since your book, The God Virus, and as you mentioned to me before, that was actually your third book, but your other two books were more meaty psychology books, right?
Right.
You're a doctor of psychology?
Right. Got my doctorate in counseling psychology at Vanderbilt, 1978.
And what led a psychologist to write two books with God in the title?
Well, I thought I was going to be a minister when I was growing up. I grew up in a very conservative fundamentalist home, loving parents, doing the best they could, and they thought, of course, religion was important. And I did too at the time. I got a degree. I went on to college, got a degree in anthropology, sociology, which kind of opened my eyes to other ways of thinking about religion. But I still went on to seminary. I got my master's degree, a 2-year master's at Scarrett College for Christian Workers in Nashville, Tennessee. And after 2 years of that, I realized I couldn't tell other people to believe what I didn't believe. So I went on to get my doctorate in psychology from there. But I continued to teach Sunday school. I continued to attend church because I had kids. I had a wife that was religious and all that. But slowly but surely, I just, it got worse and worse. It's hard to stand up. And I actually was a substitute preacher in a Presbyterian church for a while. And it was kind of funny. I almost never got asked to come back and preach at the same church twice because I had such liberal sermons. And, this is Kansas and Missouri. You don't preach a liberal sermon in Kansas or Missouri.
So what would be the difference between a liberal sermon and one that's not?
Well, a liberal sermon might not even use the word Jesus. It might have a whole lot of psychology in it. Or I might just take the really highly selective parts of the Jesus narrative out of the Bible and use that as, and I didn't, preach any hellfire or brimstone, obviously. So, yeah, you can be too liberal around here, and that's what happened. So I was a failure as a minister.
So basically, the difference is a liberal preacher is the one who used like the Jefferson Bible versus the King James one.
I was preaching Unitarian sermons in Presbyterian churches. That's the problem, yeah.
Like I said, the Jefferson Bible versus the...
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right. So that makes more sense then. So that's why you have such a affinity to write your past couple of books about God. The one before your current book, which is Sex and God, the one before that was the God Virus.
Right, yeah. Right.
So tell me a very short little summary of what the God Virus was before we get to your new book.
Well, it was inspired, of course, by Richard Dawkins and memetics. I looked at Dawkins, I looked at Hitchens, Harris, Dennett, and none of them are psychologists. And I love all their books. Victor Stinger, a physicist. I love all those folks' books, but there's no psychologist writing about this, and nobody was exploring the idea of how religions propagate themselves. So I just took what basically Richard Dawkins did in an essay, The Viruses of the Mind, and took off and said, okay, let's look at the psychology of this. Let's look at how memes, and I only used the word meme once in the entire God Virus book, because I didn't want the reader to get hung up on the whole narrative, issues around memes and memetics. I'm just shocked at how well, even as the author, I was shocked at how well the metaphor worked. And it is a metaphor, and I'm not claiming that religion's a virus. I am claiming it acts a hell of a lot like a virus. So working it out, writing about it. Of course, whenever you write a book, you learn 10 times more than what you ever can express in itself. And I was just very pleasantly surprised. And of course the feedback, because it's been a huge seller. I've sold tens of thousands of God Virus, and I never expected publishers, when they looked at it, said, well, you might be lucky to get 5,000 sold, but sold looking right around 30,000 volumes right now. So it's doing very well and continues to sell well. It just shocks me how much people love that book. But one of the things about it was chapter 5 of the God Virus is about sex in the God Virus, and people really responded to that chapter, which led me to think about, well, maybe I ought to explore that more, because I've always been interested in sex. Well, I decided I was going to write about sex and God, and that's how this book came about.
And that's what I would do the interview about today, which is your newer book. Now, this has been out for about 3 or 4 months now? Yeah, it came out earlier this year. It's just starting to get traction right now. Yeah, it's Sex and God. What I love about this book, if I would encourage everybody to get this book and then read it like on the subway, because I guarantee you people would like look at you a little bit and it's like, what is that about? Well, actually, a blogger out of Houston, she did exactly that. She said she got on the airplane and intentionally flashed it with everybody, and interesting conversations. Well, it's a good conversation starter, I guess. Yeah. Now, one thing I did like about this book is not just that it is just about sex. It really does an overall history of how human societies have viewed sex through the ages. I was first doing research for the book. I realized that almost no one has written about this subject. Literally, you go search, I could find nothing. Nobody has written about the intersection of religion, anthropology, human sexuality. So it says something about the power of religion. There's nothing more obvious than religion's interest in our sex lives. Why aren't we talking out loud about it? And I think it's because religion really does have the power to blind us to things that are just right in front of our eyes. Well, I love that you even talk about a lot of that. And when you say things like, when did it become taboo for women to not expose their breasts in the Western culture, but in other cultures they still do. And it really just roots back to some of our hang-ups with some of the religious teaching. Patriarchy is the key to understanding how religion works in our society, but you have to go back to understand patriarchy itself, because it predates what we would see as the current universal religion: Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Mormonism. Those are all patriarchal religions. And as those religions spread, they spread control of property, and as patriarchy spreads, it has to control property, and it has to control women specifically, and children. So understanding patriarchy shows why control of women and children and property is so important. Then the major religions come along, and they just pretty much take advantage of the proclivities of patriarchy to control, and it really helps religions propagate. So I really try to explain how that all works in Sex and God. But I think it's important because we're seeing the manifestations of patriarchal religion all over right now in just our political process. I mean, I live close to Missouri, and we got Todd Aiken, who's out here, trying to tell women what they can and can't do. And it's this attempt of religion to reassert itself over women and women's bodies. But understanding the patriarchy is, I think, and the patriarchal systems and why our current religions use it is really important to understanding why they're so interested in our sex lives, and how only certain kinds of sex are important or allowed or disallowed and that sort of stuff. I noticed you did a lot of that in the book. You talked about how it always seems that women get the short end of the stick over and over again, and it's usually when religion is in charge of country or the society that they're involved with. Yes, right. And you mentioned earlier nakedness. Right from the Genesis story, nakedness is a big issue. It's obviously a sexual issue even in Genesis. But as you watch the almost like a disease spreading over the face of the planet with the expansion of Christianity or with the expansion of Islam, you'll see that the sexual taboos change always in the direction
of that particular religion. So when Islam spreads into India, women who had never covered their breasts before are suddenly required to cover up. In South India, where it's incredibly hot, there's no reason to have full dress on. And people had never been fully dressed in that area until Islam came in. And even though Islam never conquered that area, it did rule over that area. And so it forced Hindu women to cover themselves up. And I do think religion, as I say in the God Virus, religion is a sexually transmitted disease.
Yeah, it's funny that you put it that way when you talk about it in the terms of things like female circumcision and such. It might be.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence for it. Just think about, what if you took sex out of religion? The religions would collapse. Catholicism could not survive without sexual craziness. I mean, celibacy. That is a sexual concept, whether you like it or not. It's sexual. Virgin Mary, that's a sexual concept. Jesus never being married, that's a sexual concept. What we don't realize is how much sex there is in the religions that are surrounding us. If you've just been exposed to it all your life, you'd never think about it. But these are sexual concepts. It is a sexual concept that Jesus never married. And one part I write in the book, and I actually got some assistance from Richard Carrier because he's such an expert in this area. If you think about it, there's almost no references. There are no references to most of the wives of the disciples. Jewish men in the 30s and 40s CE had to be married. There's almost no way for a man to be that old, to be 25 or 30, and not be married. And so you see all these 12, 13 disciples of this so-called guy named Jesus, who himself was called rabbi and wasn't married, which is incredibly unusual. How could somebody be called rabbi? Even today, how would somebody be called rabbi and not be married? So we got 13 people who there's almost no reference. Now, we do have a reference to maybe Peter being married. Paul probably was married because he was a major player in the hierarchy. So what's very interesting, I think, is how did all these women get edited out of the Bible? These are important people. And those people had wives, and those people had children. There's no reference to their wives, or almost no reference, and there's certainly no reference to their children. And why is that? And I explore that in the book, and I say, well, the reason for that is probably because that is a sexual idea. Having children, Jesus being married, Peter having a wife and having children, or any of the disciples, those are sexual ideas, and the Catholic Church is very anti-sex. So it creates these myths around none of these people had children, none of these people were married, or if they did, that's not important. Well, it is important. It's important to show how the sexual oppression has taken place, especially in the Catholic Church, but certainly, as we could talk about later, in many other churches.
Yeah, I was going to say, you kind of explore a little bit of the different views on sex in the different religions, and sadly, there's not much difference other than some of the details.
They're right. Not much difference. Women are just as oppressed in Hinduism and Buddhism. Don't let anybody fool you. Buddhism oppresses women, except, of course, California Buddhism. Islam certainly oppresses women. Christianity oppresses, all of them have the same kind of rules. Now, they may vary. I mean, we don't make our women dress up cover to cover, but, there are men out there that are saying, Christian men, they're saying to women, you shouldn't dress like that because you're tempting me. Well, that's crazy.
It's some of the reasons why many people buy into the fact that, rape happens because the girls dress sexy.
It's fundamental to all the patriarchal religions. And I do include Hinduism and Buddhism in patriarchal religions. Women are shamed because that's the best way to control women and their sexuality. In patriarchal religions, we need to control property and control the children, as well as the women, because, sex is how you get children. So that's why sex is so important to all the patriarchal religions. and why shame is so important. Shame is actually the critical tool for patriarchal religions. It makes women responsible not only for their own sexuality, but for the sexuality of men as well. So if a woman gets raped, it's her own fault in a patriarchal religion. And we're seeing that here. I mean, Todd Aiken saying here in Missouri, the Senate candidate saying there's legitimate rape, and that women's bodies can ward off true rape and all that kind of craziness. It's just insane, but it looks insane. But if you look at it in terms of the patriarchy and the men, one of the key and core values of Christianity, but it's also key and core to the other major religions, is that men are more important than women. Men are higher than women in every single religion. I mean, you just have to read the Old Testament or the New Testament to find that out. Or look at the Book of Mormon. Look at the way Mormonism is configured. Men are the ones going to heaven. The women are going to have to go on their coattails. That's the way it works in Mormonism, in Hinduism, in Islam. They're all the same. Men are a step above women, and that makes men have to control women. In fact, one of the best ways to shame a man is because the man did not control the women, not to control a woman's sexuality. It is that in many cultures, including in our own culture, it is a shame to the man if his daughter gets pregnant, say out of wedlock, or it's a shame to the man if his wife has an affair or something like that. So men are actually shamed through the woman's sexuality because they didn't control the woman. We see that especially in Islam. I mean, just this horrendous treatment of women in Islam, and men murdering their daughters, murdering their sisters, murdering their own wives because of the so-called shame the wife brings on to the family. But that's the way patriarchal religion works. What we're currently seeing in our own political situation right now is a reassertion by the evangelical religious right of this notion that women are subservient to men. Women's sexuality should be controlled by men. And we see this in Rush Limbaugh shaming Sandra Fluke and saying she shouldn't be talking about birth control, and Todd Aiken talking about legitimate or non-legitimate rape, and John Ashcroft, when he was Attorney General of the United States under the Bush administration, some of the crazy stuff he talked about, and the reassertion of trying to outlaw abortion or the woman's right to choose. All those are efforts by religion to reassert the patriarchal control over female sexuality. I really think that is a fundamental way that we as secularists need to start talking. We need to start being out about this and saying, it's not just my religion against yours or my ideas against yours. It is a concerted effort. Now, I've seen it called the war on women. The war on women is not new. It's been going on for 3,000, 4,000 years among the patriarchal religions. And I want to call, part of the reason I wrote Sex and God is I want to call people out on this. I want to say right to the religionists, your real goal is to control women and to control children and to make them feel shame about their sexuality and to shame men for not controlling women in their sexuality.
I notice that a lot, especially when you look at things like, the whole thing about abortion, like you mentioned. It's legal here in America, but yet our overseas policy is we will shut down any money that's sent overseas if that country allows abortion. Or that, it's amazing to me because it's like, well, it's legal here. Why do we want to assert that somewhere else? That it's bizarre to me.
Look at the statistics in the United States. Who has the most abortions? It's not secular people. It's religious people. Such a high abortion rate. Yeah, I don't know if you saw that study that just came out this week from St. Louis. It says when you get free birth control, abortions go way down.
Go figure.
So one of the big reasons I wrote Sex and God is I really wanted us as secular people not just to challenge the culture and drain the water out of the swamp and really look at where all these issues, where these ideas are really coming from, patriarchal religion, but also to look inside of ourselves and challenge our own assumptions about things. Derek, I come across so many people, atheists, secularists, skeptical thinkers, who do not think skeptically about their own sexual ideas, practices, and values. we live in a polluted culture. It's polluted by all kinds of religious craziness. And it's like a fish swimming in polluted water. The fish can't escape it. It's just there. I think we ought to look at how we've been polluted and start questioning some things. I in my talks, I talk about shame and guilt, and I find that there's a lot of secularists still feel guilty about stuff that they learned as a child. You know, for example, I have parents, because I'm so involved in this whole issue of child rearing and sexuality and all, I have parents tell me, I can't talk to my children. It embarrasses me. I can't talk to my children because I don't want them to know I had sex before marriage. And these are atheists, you know. There's something wrong with that.
Well, I wonder if this harkens back to your other book, The God Virus, where it's just ingrained in society.
Well, it's ingrained in society, but it's ingrained in us as members of that society. And I think it's unconscious. We haven't examined these areas of our life. So I'll ask a parent, okay, what makes you feel embarrassed about talking about your premarital sex? That you had premarital partners before the father of your children? What makes that embarrassing to you? And we start examining that, and it inevitably leads right back to early childhood religious training and shame, especially on the woman's part. Men aren't necessarily ashamed of it, but then again, men are also even more reticent to talk to their children about sex and sexuality. I've found, no matter whether they're secular or not. I don't know if you're familiar with the big, huge research we did last year on 14,560 secularists, atheists, and their sex lives.
No, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, we question, I won't go into detail about it, but we questioned 14,560 atheists about their sex lives last year. And the report's online. You can download it for free at ipcpress.com. And what we found was we were testing one of the key components of the God virus was something I call the guilt cycle. And I wanted to test the guilt cycle. The guilt cycle is fairly simple. You get taught what to be guilty of by your religion, and then as you get older, you commit crimes or sins rather around those things, like, you know, don't masturbate, don't have sex before marriage. If you do any of those things, which 95 or 100% of the people do, you got to get forgiveness for that. Well, the only place you can get relief from the guilt is back at the religion you learned the guilt from. Catholics do not confess their sins to Baptist ministers. Baptists don't confess their sins to Muslim imams. The only place you can get rid of your sin is going back to the place you learned about the sin, or learned about the guilt in the first place. So I wanted to test that theory because I'd never seen any good social psychological research on that. And what we found was the more conservative and more cult-like religions put a lot more emphasis on the guilt around sexuality. We asked the question, how much guilt were you taught as a child based on your home of origin and the religion in that home of origin. And oh, by the way, I'm going to let you guess. What was the number one most guilty religion out of 28 U.S. religions?
Catholics.
That's what a lot of people say. Nope, it wasn't.
Oh.
Number one was Mormons.
Oh, well, I wasn't even thinking about that. You're probably right.
Yeah, and not far behind them were Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Those four look cult-like. They have incredible amounts of guilt around sex and shame around sex. In fact, they have a lot more shame around sex than any of the other religions. However, Catholics are down a little bit farther, but they're still pretty guilty and shameful about their sexual behavior. So what we found was lots of guilt and shame around sex, and the more liberal religions had less and less and less. In fact, the most liberal religion we found had less guilt around sex than even atheists had. Yeah, guess which religion that was?
Oh, will that be was it the Unitarians?
Absolutely. Unitarians had the lowest level of guilt of any of the people we tested. even just slightly lower than atheists and agnostics. We were surprised, so I started investigating, and I found out that Unitarians have a very good sex education course. And it's in cooperation with some other very, very liberal churches like the Church of Christ or something or some of those others. But it teaches age-appropriate sex education to the children right inside the church. And it's sex positive, it's gay friendly, it has all the things that I would like to see in a sex education program. I was not even aware of that program until after I started investigating. Why are the Unitarians so guilt-free? I guess they're having orgies every Sunday in Unitarian church. But it was very interesting to see that there are people out there within a religious community, Unitarians in this case, who are pretty sex positive. Of course, they're not patriarchal, and they don't have that infection that you have to control women's sexuality and shame women for who and what they are.
Well, that's the reason why I went right to them, is because they don't have the hang-ups on the female members of their group.
Right.
So you mentioned that, I find it interesting in the book that you talk about all the different religions, and there's very, very few where the whole problem with sex doesn't exist.
Many, many people inside of religion are incredibly uptight about their sexuality. And I write a lot about that in the book, how marriage, Christian marriage, every time you have sex as a Christian, you're having a threesome with Jesus. And it works like this. You get in bed with your wife or your husband, and you know Jesus is watching you. So you've got to do things just the way Jesus says you should. You can't do this or that. You can't have anal sex, for example. You can't watch pornography. You can't talk dirty. You can't spank your husband or your wife. You can't whatever that is that Jesus says you can't do, you have to be aware that he's watching you. So it's really kind of weird if you think about it. And all these religions have this third party in your bedroom telling you what you can and you can't do. It's insidious.
Well, it's funny you say that, because somebody actually did a cartoon, on a web cartoon, about that exact issue, where they actually had, Jesus like popping up everywhere, like in their bedroom, in their shower, and
true.
It was pretty much exactly the same thing you just said.
I dated a Catholic gal. This is 20 years ago or so. I dated her for about 4 months, and I would. She mainly came over to my house, but occasionally I'd show up at her house, her apartment. Rarely. This is before cell phones. So one day I just show up unannounced, and I go in and I find on her bedroom wall all these crucifixes and Bibles and Mary, things that I'd never noticed before. And I asked her, where'd all these things come from? And she said, well, I always take them down when you come over because I just can't come with Jesus watching me. That's what's going on in religious marriages. And so what happens over a period of time is the guilt starts taking over the marriage. And my hypothesis, and I think I got quite a bit of data to back it up in many ways, is the longer you're in a religious marriage, the less sex you have. Now, that's not just because of religion. I'm not going to say that, because as humans, we like variety and, that sort of stuff. But I've talked to people who've been married for, 30 years and say, I haven't had sex in 20 years because my wife feels guilty about it, or she doesn't want to have it anymore. She says that's just for having children. And when you start looking into it, it drives right back to religion. Rich Lyons, who runs the Living After Faith podcast, the official podcast of our group, Recovering from Religion, has an episode called Too Fucked Up to And it's his story of how screwed up his sex life was as a minister. He says, I had sex, I think he said 12 times in 20 years. And they didn't even consummate their marriage until they'd been married almost 3 years. Now that is really crazy sexuality. But even more crazy, he's this pastor of this Pentecostal church. And guys, men, are coming to him for counseling saying, my wife won't have sex with me anymore. When we got married, we had a great sex for 6 months or 8 months or whatever. And now they won't have. So here's Rich, who's had sex 12 times in his whole life at this point, counseling men. He said virtually every man came to him in his church asking for help to deal with their wife's lack of sexual interest. That is religion driving guilt into women and making them not want to have sex. Now, Derek, I don't know about you, but I think women have a bigger sex drive, more interested in sex than men do. And there's a lot of evidence for that in other cultures. But in our culture, we suppress women's sexuality. We shame women for expressing their sexuality. We shame women for talking about their desires. Other cultures don't necessarily do that. If you look at Hawaiian culture before pre-contact, or the Manganian culture in the South Seas, women drove the sexuality. If you look at the Na culture in China, women are totally in charge of the sexual relationship. We can see lots and lots of cultures where women are very sexual, very open about their sexuality, unashamed, and express it whenever they darn well please. But when patriarchal religion comes in, it shuts people down. It particularly shuts women down. I think women suffer more from religion than anybody else, and they're the most religious. If you go to church on any given Sunday morning, 60% or more of all the people in that church are female. Men don't go to church nearly as much as women do. Why are they there? Because they feel shame and guilt, oftentimes, about their sexuality. That's where they get the reprieve from this shame and guilt. And it keeps them infected, and oh, by the way, it's going to keep their children infected. That's why religion is so important, keeping people infected with a particular God virus, a particular religion.
You just depressed me a little bit.
Sorry about that. I do have some hope here. I mean, look at this. I think one of the biggest hopes. I want to bring you out of your depression here.
Right.
No psychologist should
cheer me
depress
up.
anybody.
Cheer me up.
I think the gay community has set the standard for what we should be doing. The gays have come out and they say, we are no longer ashamed of our sexuality, and we are not going to let you shame us. We're not going to let you control us. In fact, we're going to start asking for the same rights that you had, for example, in gay marriage. But in a lot of other areas, in terms of employment, non-discrimination around employment and things like that. We should be doing the same thing. As secularists, we should be saying, we are sexual creatures, and I am not ashamed of who I am as a sexual person. I am not a Christian, and I don't need to act like a Christian. I see way too many atheists and secularists and humanists acting like Christians. And that's just crazy. Why are we adhering and kowtowing to these Christian norms around sexuality and marriage and sexual talk and training and teaching our children around sex and sexuality? I give a number of examples. In fact, I think the most important part of Sex and God is the last 5 chapters in the book, because that's where I really say, let's look at ourselves, let's look at the way we're living, let's look at our assumptions that underlie how we're behaving day to day with our spouses, with our children, with our neighbors, and start coming out, kind of like what the gay community has done. The LGBTQ community is right out there, and it has forced the evangelical community to stand up and take notice. Now they're fighting back, but they're losing the battle. They're losing it all over the place. In fact, we may see the first major battle lost in Washington State this next month when they've got gay marriage on the ballot. And it's predicted that it may actually pass for the first time in any U.S. state. A gay marriage bill passed through the electorate, not through the judiciary or the legislature.
Well, I've been to Seattle. You might be right. They probably will going to pass it.
Yeah, it looks close, but it could pass. So
yeah, people forget how much farmland there is in Washington State. So
yeah, there is a lot in the eastern part.
Yeah, people forget about that.
Yeah.
So we got toward the end of the book right there. So let's move on to something new you have coming up. There's something to do with Richard Dawkins.
Oh, yeah, I'm really excited about this. It actually will come out October 15th in the United Kingdom. A year ago, I got a phone call out of the blue. The research I mentioned earlier about our sex and sexuality on 14,000 people. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, Richard Dawkins came to Kansas City, interviewed me for a couple hours on this for this documentary that's coming out October 15th. But one of the things he's concerned about in this documentary is death. And I mean, the title's Sex and Death. it's quite interesting because great minds must think alike here. I was writing in the Sex and God, I wrote about the connection between sex and death in my book, not knowing that Richard Dawkins was doing that in his own documentary too. So it's parallel tracks in this universe, I guess. I see a very close connection between sex and death. If you think about it, we said earlier, you're having a threesome with Jesus if you're in a religious marriage. Well, Jesus is saying if you do sex wrong, you're going to die forever. You're going to be punished in hell forever. And sexual sin is among the worst sin of all the patriarchal religions. You can't get any worse than having an affair outside of marriage, for example, or masturbating. That's going to send you straight to hell. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. That's the way sex is connected to death. So imagine if every time you think about lust after another person, every time you masturbate, every time you have sex that's not exactly the way your religion prescribes it, you also have the thought afterwards, oh, I'm going to hell. I'm going to burn forever. How many times do you do that before it starts impacting the pleasure you receive with sex and the way you interact with your sex partner or partners? It's insidious. It slowly but surely eats away at your sexuality, at your ability to express yourself. It leads men to become impotent. It leads women to reject sex and feel so guilty about it. And that's how sex and death are connected, through the concept of eternal damnation and hell, and sex being among the worst things that can happen to you. So that's why I'm so excited about the Richard Dawkins documentary that comes out later, because he's dealing with the same thing I'm talking about in the book. And I don't think anyone has dealt with this idea of the connection between death and sex and religion out loud. I've never seen it before. So it's fun to see somebody else getting on this as well.
So that if it's from BBC, maybe it'll be on BBC America?
I have no idea. The producer said it will be marketed in the United States. He fully expects it to get picked up, but he couldn't say where yet.
All right. So we'll have to hope.
Yeah, I know. Hope. They're sending me a DVD, so I'll get to see it.
So, and you're involved with the Secularist Therapist Project as well?
Yes, that's really an important initiative that started just this year. I got to go back a couple of years, though. Back to 2009, I started an organization called Recovering from Religion, and it's grown. It's grown dramatically. We've got about 150 meetings, people meeting kind of like AA all over the United States, even in Australia, United Kingdom, Canada, Bangladesh, India. We have people coming together to discuss how do they get over the trauma of being raised in a sexual environment. How do you deal with my ex-wife who's still religious, or my current husband who's still religious? Those kinds of things. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous for the formerly religious, if you will. Let's call it our Recovering from Religion. But as a result of that, I've just gotten so many requests from people after they read The God Virus, after they read Sex and God. They say, I need a therapist. I need somebody to talk to. Going to a meeting and simply talking with other ex-Christians or ex-Muslims or ex-Mormons isn't doing everything I need. So, Derek, I went out and started helping people find secular therapists. And I tell you, I had the hardest time. You cannot get online and look for a psychologist through Psychology Today listing. You cannot tell if that psychologist is secular or not. You can't tell if they're read the Bible every day and pray. You can't tell if they're into New Age woo-woo stuff. So it's really difficult. And I realized after trying to help several people find a good secular therapist, this is impossible. So I, along with Han Hills out of North Carolina, Han has helped me develop this incredible website. It's very sophisticated, and it's taken hundreds of hours on his part and mine to put together. But it's like Match.com or OkCupid. It's like a dating site, but it's a dating site for psychologists and clients to get together. Now, you might ask the question, why do you need a dating site or a site that acts like one? Because if if I, as a psychologist, announced in Oklahoma City, for example, if I'm a psychologist in Oklahoma City, and I say, I'm an atheist, half of my clients will leave me tomorrow because they're all religious.
Yeah.
And more importantly, my sources, my referral sources, are oftentimes churches or religious institutions like hospitals. The minute you say, I'm a therapist and I'm an atheist, you lose your entire practice. So then go the other side. I'm a client and I'm trying to find a secular therapist. I don't want to go to a therapist for 3 months and find out they pray every day and they think I should. Or go to a therapist and find out, they think I should go back and read the Bible more because that's what I did as a child. I can't find one because they can't advertise. So our system, you can go to seculartherapy.org and you can search by zip code to find out if there's a therapist in your area. If your listeners are listening, if you are a therapist or you know of a good secular therapist, tell them to register with us because it's a free service. We don't charge a dime for this. You get on, you register as a psychologist or a social worker, and we screen all the people that register with us. You have to prove to us that you're secular, you're atheist, you're a humanist, and then we'll put you into the register. And then if you're a client and you want to find somebody, you'll be fairly confident that if you find somebody through our service, that they are not going to send you back to church, and they're not going to ask you to get your chakras realigned. So that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny because there's something I never really thought about until you mentioned your service, because I just don't think about that. And once I heard it, it was like, well, that makes so much sense.
Well, here's the problem. And you're in the Atlanta, Georgia area, right?
Yeah.
There's a Christian counselor on every street corner in Atlanta, Georgia. Try and find an atheist counselor in Atlanta, Georgia. They are there.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Yeah, but they cannot advertise. Now, even worse, Liberty University, Regents University, Oral Roberts University. I just looked, you can go online and look at Regents University PhD psychology. Can you imagine a PhD psychologist from Pat Robertson's Regents University? How's that even possible? But it is.
Well, yeah.
And when you look on the yellow pages or look online and you see PhD psychologist, Regents University, well, the average person won't be a problem. They don't understand what's the problem there. Well, the problem is that person has Pat Robertson's theology in his or her head. That's the guy that thinks it sends hurricanes to Orlando or Katrina to New Orleans to punish them for having gay tolerance. So you cannot expect somebody who got their PhD from Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell's University to be gay friendly or to be sex positive. There are right now thousands of therapists being graduated from religious universities who are getting licenses in states all around the United States, and their goal is to keep you infected with religion. They may be well trained. In the back of their mind is this idea that Jesus saves. Jesus is the answer to everything. I wouldn't want to waste my time and my money going to a psychologist who got his PhD from Regents University, Oral Roberts, or any other religious university for that matter, maybe with a few exceptions. How do you find them? And the only way, that's how I discovered this need here. You can't find them, so let's start our own service and let's get registered secular therapists. Then you don't have to worry about whether they're going to send you back to Jesus or not.
I find it a really great service for that reason, because I've run into people who in my, just travels into conferences or just meeting people who are secular or atheist or skeptics or whatever, and they have a hard time thinking about, well, what happens if my therapist or my doctor thinks that way? So it's amazing to me that somebody didn't think about it before.
Well, it's kind of amazing to me too, but hey, I thought about it, so I need help. I need lots of help getting the word out there. 60% of all therapists in our database have been contacted by clients. You're in business to help people. You're also in business to make a little money, I know. So and you got a whole group of people out there wanting to talk to you. they're not going to go to a Christian counselor if they can avoid it. They need a secular counselor.
I will have that link in the show notes, so anybody who hears that, go and make sure that if you know somebody or you yourself need somebody, that's a great place to go.
Good.
So thank you so much for taking some time with me.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you happen to be a professional therapist, please take the time to go over to seculartherapy.org and register. Or if you have any family members or friends who are therapy workers, let them know about the service. Also, if you need to find a therapist who works from a perspective of science and critical thought, you might be able to use this service to make your search a lot easier. You can find links to the site, Darrel's book, and everything else you heard on this episode in the show notes at www.skepticality.com.
Hungry for more skepticism? Want to learn the truth about the scientific controversies of our time? Then subscribe to Skeptic, the quarterly magazine Stephen Jay Gould called the best journal in the field. To subscribe, visit skeptic.com today.